So in this chapter, we'll discuss about the types of banks. So based on ownership, broadly banks are classified as public sector banks, private sector banks, and foreign banks. Public sector banks are banks where the majority stake, say more than 50%, is held by the government of India. And the rest of all the banks are the private banks. Within private banks, if you can say if the ownership is foreign, they're called foreign banks, otherwise just private banks. One trick question asked in bank interviews is what's the difference between public sector banks and nationalized banks. So for that, we have to understand first of all what is nationalized banks are. So nationalization is a process of transforming private assets into public assets. To put it simply, it is bringing companies into the ownership of the government. So what happens is, like, if a private company is taken over by the government, it's known as nationalization. Of course, the private owners will be compensated, but there will be situations when government will take over a private company into its own ownership. Right? So government does this when it doesn't do this routinely. It does this when there is a social objective to be met. For example, Air India was nationalized. That famous airline was nationalized in 1953. However, the famous example of nationalization in India is the bank's nationalization of 1969. That's a very important identification. When was bank's nationalization held in India? That is 1969. Then the Congress government, headed by Mrs. Indira Gandhi, has nationalized 14 banks. That is on July 19th, 1969. Later, in 1980, 6 more banks were nationalized. So altogether, 20 banks were nationalized. And those banks covered almost the entire spectrum of the banking space in the country at that time. Almost 90% of the banking business was controlled by these 20 banks. So nationalizing these banks overnight has changed these private banks into government banks. So immediately it was the government controlling the banking sector. It was very important. It was done with an objective. So you'll be asked that question: what are the reasons for bank nationalization? Right? So we'll see those reasons now. But before that, if they ask you what is the number of nationalized banks, just don't say 20, say 19. Okay? So that is the standard answer, because subsequent to the nationalization, 2 of those banks have merged. Okay? So New Bank of India has merged with Punjab National Bank. So right now we have only 19 nationalized banks. Okay. So what are the reasons for bank nationalization? So first of all, like, people by nature are very skeptical of private banks. Okay. Because basically it's the money. Our money we are putting in banks. So we have to be very cautious. So common people are more comfortable if it is a government bank. Okay. So what happens if the private bank runs away with the money? There is no protection. Okay. So government banks, people have public confidence. Also, private banks' focus is quite different. They won't focus on less profitable activities like agriculture or small industries. They are very important critical areas for the economy, for the country as a whole, but they are not profitable. And private banks will not get into those. They won't lend loans to those areas. Okay. If it is a government bank, government will focus on those sectors also. Right. Also, private banks will focus on urban areas a lot, where they have more business. And then neglect rural or semi-urban areas. Whereas government will operate equally in all areas. Okay. So these are some of the reasons why a bank nationalization was done by the government in the 1969. And you should understand that India's economy, 70% of the population lives in rural areas. So if that 70% is neglected, it will have an impact on the entire country. So providing access of credit and money to the rural sector is very important. So banks nationalization was done with that objective in mind. Now, besides these 19 banks, there are other banks which are also government banks, but they're not nationalized in the sense that, say for example, SBI. SBI is a public sector bank. It's not nationalized bank because it was not nationalized in that 1969. From the beginning, it was a government. I mean, it used to be called Imperial Bank. It was converted into State Bank a long time ago. It is not part of that 1969 tranche where it was nationalized. Okay, so SBI, IDBI Bank, these are all public sector banks, but not nationalized banks. Now, there's one more information you should know. Earlier bank, there used to be a bank called Imperial Bank. Reserve Bank of India got a stake in that in 1955, which later became State Bank of India. So when we say nationalized bank, don't include State Bank of India in it. Okay. Now, in private sector banks, there are 2 main classifications: old private sector banks and new private sector banks. So just now we discussed that there were 20 banks that were nationalized in 1969 and 1980. So they constituted like 90% of the entire banking business of the country. But there is some 10% still left. Okay. So those banks, what about those banks? Those banks were not nationalized. the government didn't think they were that big, to nationalize them. So they just left with them. So they were private sector banks, still continuing. So those banks which are still existing today, they're known as old private sector banks. Okay, so examples of those banks are, some examples, Karur Vysya Bank, Lakshmi Vilas Bank, etc. Now, after economic liberalization of 1991, which we'll discuss in a later chapter, government has given permission licenses to new banks to come up. Those are known as new generation private sector banks. All the big banks we see today in the private sector, like ICICI Bank, HDFC, Axis Bank, all these have origins in the post-liberalization era. So those are known as new private sector banks. Okay. So another question which you need to be ready with is, name some latest banks. I mean, those were formed in the recent past, say 5 years or so. And why were they started? What is the priority area where they're operating? So some recent banks are like Bandhan Bank, Mudra Bank, Mahalo Bank, and India Post Payments Bank. So like Bandhan Bank, core philosophy is regarding financial inclusion. We have not discussed financial inclusion yet, but we'll discuss in a later chapter. But for now, understand that Bandhan Bank was formed with its focus as financial inclusion. The company that has promoted Bandhan Bank is known as Bandhan Financial Holdings, which is into microfinance. Okay, so we didn't discuss microfinance, so that this may be confusing to you right now, but we'll come across it in a later chapter. Then there's Mudra Bank. Mudra Bank is Microfinance Development and Finance Agency Bank. It provides loans to microfinance institutions and NBFCs, who then go on to provide loans to MSMEs. MSMEs are micro, small and medium enterprises. This also we'll discuss later. Then there is Mahalo Bank, but Mahalo Bank is right now not in existence. It was merged with SBI in 2017, but it was actually started as a bank exclusively for women. Okay. Then there is India Post Payments Bank, that was incorporated as a public sector bank and Department of Posts. Okay. One advantage with this is it has got a lot of post offices across India, more than 1.5 lakhs post offices, so they can operate aggressively in the rural sector. Now, note that India Post Payments Bank, we are using a term called Payments Bank. The Payments Bank are actually a new model that is started by RBI. So these banks can accept a restricted deposit. So currently it is restricted to just 1 lakh per customer. It might be increased later. And these banks cannot issue loans or credit cards. Right? They just operate the basic savings account and current accounts. Okay. They issue services like ATM cards and debit cards and mobile banking, net banking. Right? So you might have heard of Airtel payment, and Paytm, and all these are payment banks. Okay. This will discuss in a later chapter again. Also, you'll come across terms called scheduled bank. Okay. So all banks included in the second schedule of the RBI Act are known as scheduled banks. So they comprise of the scheduled commercial banks and scheduled cooperative banks. So I mean, you need not get into too deep into it, but just for information, scheduled cooperative banks consists of the state cooperative banks and the urban cooperative banks. And the scheduled commercial banks are classified into 5 different groups: nationalized banks, other public sector banks, that is the 19 plus 2, 19 nationalized banks and 2 other public sector banks, that is SBI and IBPS. We have some private sector banks, 36, foreign banks are 43, payment banks right now are 4, and RRBs, that's the regional rural banks, 56. You need not remember all this. Just if they ask you to tell examples of each type of bank, you should be able to tell. For example, they might ask, tell us 2 examples of public sector banks. So public sector banks are like SBI, Bank of India, like Bank of Baroda, Punjab National Bank, Canara Bank, Syndicate Bank. All these are public sector banks. Examples of private sector banks are ICICI Bank, HDFC Bank, and Axis Bank. Examples of foreign banks will be Citibank, Standard Chartered Banks, HSBC, Barclays. Right? So if they ask how many banks are there in India, roughly you can say around 100. So because 19 plus 2 plus 36 plus 43, it comes to 100. The major banks are public sector banks, private sector banks, and foreign banks. However, there are also other banks which you need not go into in depth, but just be aware of that they exist. Now, besides number of banks, you might also be asked to how many bank branches are there. So as on 2015 figures, March, there are around 1.25 lakh bank branches in the country. Another slightly tricky question that asks is how much population is served per branch. This is simply the population of the country divided by the number of bank branches. So this for India is around 10,000. Okay, so which means there is a bank branch, one bank branch for every 10,000 population. So it's a figure used to compare how banked, you can say how densely banked the country is. So the questions in this chapter you can be asked like, what are the different types of banks, or what are the various categories of banks based on ownership. So this will be public, private, and foreign. So what are public sector banks? Give some examples. You have to be aware of this. What are private sector banks? Give examples. Foreign banks, nationalist banks. Difference between public sector banks and private sector banks. That's based on ownership. Difference between public sector banks and national banks. Both are government banks, but those 19 banks which are nationalized in 1969-1984 are known as nationalist banks. Give an example of a bank, a government bank which is not nationalist but still a public sector bank. That example would be SBI. Okay. So are all public sector banks nationalist banks? No. SBI and IDBI are not nationalist banks, but they are still public sector banks. Is SBI a nationalist bank? No. What is the difference between old private sector banks and new private sector banks? The private sector banks that were in existence during the 69 nationalization and the 80 nationalization, those are known as old private sector banks. And banks which were given licenses post 91, that is post the liberalization policy of the new private sector banks. So what is banks nationalization? You have to explain that. We discussed it. In which year was banks nationalization done? That was 69. How many phases it was done? 2 phases. 14 in 1969 and 6 more banks in 1980. What is the present number of nationalist banks? That is 19, not 20, because one was merged with PNB. Who was the Prime Minister of India when banks were nationalized? That was Mrs. Indira Gandhi. What were some reasons for banks was nationalized? We discussed this. Were all banks in the country that existed in 1969 nationalized? No. Majority of the banks, those 14 banks, right, and the 6 banks later, they comprised around 90% of the banking business. But still some banks were not nationalist. In which year was State Bank of India formed? We discussed this. What was State Bank of India earlier known as? We discussed this. That is Imperial Bank. What are all private sector banks? Give examples. New generation banks, examples. Name few banks that were recently formed. This we discussed. What is the specialty or what is the focus area of Bandhan Bank, Mudra Bank? Yes, we discussed this. What is Payments Bank? Give examples. Yes. Scheduled banks. What are categories of scheduled commercial banks? It's not such an important question. How many commercial banks are there in India? Around 100, you can say. Which is the newest bank? So just keep yourself updated whether any new bank has come up. How many public sector banks there in India? How many private banks? How many foreign banks? How many bank branches? What is the population per bank branch figure in India? So all these figures we discussed. So this should be quite easy.